But I wrote this book to change the narrative, to bust some myths, who does science, who should be doing science, and also just to give people stories. The reason why I use stories is so that people have another way to access the information, but also to know that, you know, Edison wasn't who we thought he was. Morse who isn't who we thought he was. So it's just a little bit more authentic.
Hello and welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the director of Cambridge Forum, and today I'm delighted to bring you a new book written by a wonderfully clever and engaging woman. Ainissa Ramirez, today's guest, is author of The Alchemy of Us, How Humans and Matter Transformed One Another. Before she explains why she wrote the book and a little bit about what's in it, let me give you a brief bio. Ramirez is an accomplished materials scientist and science writer with a passionate zeal for her subject. A graduate of both Brown and Stanford, Ainissa has worked as a research scientist at Bell Labs. She has held teaching posts at Yale and MIT, and lots more besides, writes for lots of different publications. So, welcome, Ainissa Ramirez.
Thank you so much. Well, first, I just want to say thank you. I'm so delighted for the opportunity to be able to share with you what I've been working on for the last couple of years, which is writing my book, The Alchemy of Us, How Humans and Matter Transform One Another. In the time that we have together, what I want to do is I want to just give you an origin story of the book, tell you a little bit about how it came to be, my vantage, my approach for writing it, and then I want to dive right into how technology has shaped us. Okay. As for my vantage, well, I'm a material scientist, and most people don't know what that is. I think I'm becoming more accustomed to that fact. I liken material science to my home state of New Jersey, because both material science and New Jersey are kind of wedged between two more well-familiar things. For New Jersey, that's Philadelphia and New York, and for material science, well, that's chemistry and physics. Material science lies at where they overlap. It's interested in how atoms bond, so that's the chemistry part, and then how those bonds translate into properties, how material behaves. That's the physics part. Now, I have to say that when I first heard about this topic, I wasn't really interested in it because it was a prerequisite course, which I had translated as being very, very boring. I had to take it. However, my professor said something that completely blew me away on my first day. He said, the reason why we don't fall through the floor, the reason why my sweater is blue, and the reason why the lights work, all has to do with the interaction of atoms. And if you can understand how they do that, you can get them to do new things. Now, when he said this, I stopped listening to him, which I don't think that's a good idea, but I stopped listening to him because I started looking around me and I started seeing things in a new light. The pencil in my hand, it was able to make a mark because the carbon atoms slid past each other. My glasses helped me see because they bent the light to my distant retinas. My shoes were comfortable because the molecules were kind of shaped like springs, which brought a comfort to my feet. This guy told me something that made the whole world make sense to me, and it put me on the path to becoming a material scientist. Now, I've been crazy about the topic of material science and have been trying to show why it's so compelling to other people. And the idea for how to write about material science came to me a couple of years ago by accident. I was taking a couple of glass-blowing classes to check it off my bucket list, and in that class, that's when this idea came to me. Now, I'll just keep it short, but suffice it to say, I went to glass-blowing class in a bad mood. It was an accident, nobody got hurt, but afterwards, I started thinking about how I actually felt like I was in a better mood. Well, what had happened? I was shaping the glass, and the glass was actually shaping me. And so this moment made me think, I wonder how materials and matter have been in a dance with each other in the past and how they've shaped each other. It was that glass-blowing accident that actually compelled me to look at how materials and humans have been interacting with each other, have been transforming each other over the course of generations. So what I would like to do is share with you a little bit about how I went about talking about how technology has shaped us. I decided to take a different approach. In my first chapter, I wanted to talk about how obsessed we became with time. as our timepieces became better and better and more precise, made possible by the materials inside, I wanted to say, we as a society became obsessed with time. And I could have wrote down, we became obsessed with time. That probably would have been a very short sentence. But what I decided to do is let Ruth Belville show you how obsessed with time we became. Ruth Belville was a woman who lived in England. She lived in the 19th century, and she had an unusual job. She sold time. Yep, I said that right. She sold time. She would leave her house in Maidenhead, make her way over to London, then make her way over to Greenwich, and then walk up a steep hill to the Royal Observatory. And it's there, she was carrying her pocket watch, that she would give it to the attendant and have it compared to their main clock. They'd give her a certificate, letting her know the difference between their time and her time. Then she'd make her way down the hill and then over to London, and then give her watch to various businesses that needed to know it. Ruth was called the Greenwich Time Lady. Now, I could have said how obsessed with time we were, but this woman having the ability to have a business based on selling time makes that a little bit more clear. So I took an approach of telling stories to get across my point. Another thing, I wanted to also talk about how technology sometimes goes awry. And I could have wrote down, technology goes awry. That would have been a very short sentence. But what I decided to do is let Caroline Hunter and Ken Williams show you how technology goes awry. Caroline Hunter and Ken Williams were employees of Polaroid in the early 70s. And they found out that their employer, which had made this fantastic technology of camera film that could be processed instantly, was actually selling their product to South Africa. South Africa at the time was under an apartheid government. And it ends up that black citizens had to carry a passbook, which monitored where they were going and also controlled where they were going. At the heart of the passbook was a picture made by Polaroid. Now, Caroline Hunter and Ken Williams weren't happy about this. And so they knew that this was not what they should be doing. The government, the UN, had said that America should not be interacting with South Africa. And so they went and did something about it. They knew firsthand about the impact of technology and how sometimes something that's beloved, like instant photography, can actually be sent in a different direction. So I used storytelling in showing how technology was part of our lives and putting it in a cultural setting. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about the origin story. I've talked a little bit about how I went about it. Let's dive into how technology has actually shaped us. What I want to do is I want to share with you how technology can lead to a surprise and how sometimes technology can generate an unintended consequence. Let's start off with a surprise. If I wanted to think about a case study for something that can lead to a surprise, that would actually be the telegraph. I know it's old technology, but it actually had tremendous impact on us. Let me just wipe my. It had tremendous impact on us. How did it do so? Well, let me give you the backstory first. Samuel F.B. Morse was a painter. He was an inventor, and he would have loved to have had a telegraph earlier in his life. His invention came from tragedy. He was away from home, and he got news by mail, which is the fastest way that information could travel, that his wife had died. And had he gotten information sooner, he could have rushed to be by her side, but that didn't happen. So he went on to build an invention so that other people wouldn't suffer the way that he did. Now, years later, as he was developing his telegraph, he would experiment with his assistant, Alfred Vail. And something started to bubble up in the process. As they were doing experiments where they would write things by hand, translate them into dots and dashes, and then transmit them, and then get the dots and dashes, and then convert those into words, Morse was actually starting to get a little annoyed with Vail. He would write to Vail, "Condense your language." He was telling Vail, stop using words that don't contribute to the meaning of the word. He would get a transmission. Let's say, for instance, he would get dash, 4 dots, and then another dot. And then he would translate it. And it was the word the. That's a lot of work for a word that really doesn't contribute much to the meaning. So this is why he chided Vail to condense your language. Now, decades later, the telegraph became part of American life. And telegraph officers would tell customers, look, you're happy to use this, but you have to be brief. The telegraph was great at shuttling information rapidly, but it had a limitation. It could only handle a certain number of messages at one time. So the telegraph officer told customers that they had to be brief so that they didn't tie up the line, so that it remained available. The telegraph also became part of newspapers. Newspapers enjoyed sending messages across the country very rapidly, and editors would tell their reporters that we want you to write your reports, but you have to be succinct, again, because of the limitation of the telegraph. Well, one writer really loved this style of writing with short declarative sentences, and he went on to be an author that we know today as Ernest Hemingway. So you can see this technology of the telegraph, which was designed to send information rapidly, because of its limitation, actually gave rise to the shaping of language as well. Now, there were many other factors that shaped American English, but one of them was a technology, and that technology was the telegraph. So that's a case of how a technology can give rise to a surprising outcome. Let's explore how a technology can give rise to unintended consequences. A case study for that is the light bulb. Yep, the simple light bulb. Now, when you think about the inventor of the light bulb, you think about Edison. Okay, he was not the first, he was the most famous. We can talk about Edison's contribution to the light bulb later. But let's suffice it to say that he was interested in pushing back the darkness and lengthening the day. That was his intention for creating the light bulbs. But now it's changing our world because there's an abundance of light. How is it changing the world? Well, it's changing the natural world. I can tell you that fireflies aren't too happy about the abundance of lights. Why is it? Well, because fireflies, they talk to each other with flashes of light, and it's dependent on their ability to see each other. But the overhead lights are making it that it's hard for them to see each other, it's hard for them to meet, and no future fireflies. So their numbers actually decreasing. One of the reasons is because of the abundance of lights. So that's a sad situation, that we actually have species that are being impacted. But fireflies are not the only species that are being impacted by the lights. We are, humans. Yep, it's true. It ends up that humans are actually two organisms. We have a daytime mode and a nighttime mode. In our daytime mode, we have an increase in metabolism, temperature, and growth hormone. And in the nighttime mode, all of those numbers decrease. How the body knows if it should be daytime or nighttime depends on the lights. Now, in order to understand this, we actually have to think about our eye. As you know, our eye helps us see. Light goes to the retina, which goes down through the optic nerve to the brain, where that information is reassembled as vision. But recently, and by recently I mean in the last 30 years, we have found that the eye has another role that we did not know about. Yeah, it has a photoreceptor which does not contribute to vision. It's detecting blue light. When it sees the blue light, it goes down the optic nerve to the brain, and it goes to another part of the brain which stops secreting melatonin. Melatonin is a chemical compound which tells all the cells in the body that it's nighttime mode, to be in rest mode. When the light is detected, blue light is detected, the melatonin is shut off, and so we enter into daytime mode. So in short, blue light, daytime mode. Now, long ago, when our ancestors were alive, they lived by sunlight, and then they lived by candlelight. The sun has a lot of blue in it, so they were in daytime mode, and as the sun set and they were under candlelight, which is red, they entered into nighttime mode. But we are living constantly under artificial lights, which are very strong in the blue. So we are in that growth mode all the time until we go to sleep. And you may be asking, well, what's the big deal? Well, it ends up that the change is already perceivable of being underneath those artificial lights. Scientists have said that we are taller than our ancestors. Now, sure, there's many factors that contribute to that. Nutrition, water, medicine, but another factor is artificial lights. And the reason being because our body is swimming in growth hormone, and so the cells will respond to that overstimulation. But sometimes the cells will respond in a way that's in a negative way. Epidemiologists have found that there's a certain population of people that have an increase in risk in certain diseases, including some forms of cancer. And the reason being the work that they do. They work at night underneath the electric lights. So you see, Edison had created a technology to push back the night, and to lengthen the day. But there's this unintended consequence that's come about. There's this new challenge of how do we live healthily underneath the lights? Well, it ends up that the prescription to live underneath the lights is actually pretty straightforward. What we need are bright mornings and dim evenings. We need blue light in the morning, and then we need less blue or redder light in the evening. We can get blue light from the sun. The sun has blue light, so we can go for a walk. The other option is they can use blue LEDs or compact fluorescent bulbs, which are rich in blue. Now, as the sun sets, what we need to do is actually change the type of light. The light needs to be redder, so red LEDs or incandescent bulbs will help us go into nighttime mode. Also, we need to change our devices. Our devices generate a lot of blue, so we need to put them into nighttime mode so we too can enter into nighttime mode. So this is how we can live healthily underneath the lights. Now, I hope that in this examination of how the unintended consequences that arise from the light bulb, that you see the importance of examining technologies, and it's important to put technologies, even old ones, underneath the microscope. And this is what I do in the Alchemy of Us. And I hope that in this short presentation today that you can see that we create this technology, and this technology recreates us. But most importantly, I hope that you come away with the desire to examine technologies, modern technologies, and old ones too. As I say in my parting thought in the Alchemy of Us, I say the following. Such a thoughtful analysis of the impact of inventions benefits society, not just because it's an entertaining cerebral exercise, but because when coupled with action and social change, it has the potential to help society transcend its condition and favorably further this Alchemy of Us. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Wow, there was a lot of stuff there, Ainissa. You must have done a lot of research on these people. Okay, so before we start the questions, I've got a few things. First of all, you say it's important to get people excited about science, but aren't we walking gadgetries with all our cell phones and our little devices already? Aren't we ads for science?
Well, I think it's important for us to know more science, even more so because we're surrounded by all these gadgets. And I'm saying we need to know more science, not because I want people to be scientists. I want them to be involved and see the world in a newer way. The gadgets that we have, the cell phones, they are not neutral entities. It took scientists to make them, but these materials also come from different places in the world. Some of these places are actually under a severe conflict. If we adopt some of the habits that scientists have, which is to think critically about things, then, well, maybe this can be something that we also discuss besides thinking about new features from our phone, but consider where are the materials coming from to make the phone. So that's what I'm really looking for. I'm not looking for people to go out and make new contraptions. I want them to just be more engaged. And one of the skills that scientists have is that we ask questions.
So you've certainly been asking a lot of questions all your life. So you're a young, gifted female Black scientist. Growing up, what was your role model? Was there a role model for you? And has the playing field in that regard changed for other aspiring?
That's a good question. I actually say this in the Alchemy of Us about my own origin story. I wanted to be a scientist since I was very young. I'm not sure where I got the idea from. But what sealed the deal for me is that I saw this public television program called 321 Contact. It had a reoccurring series called the Bloodhound Gang. And in it was an African-American girl solving mysteries and problems. And when I saw her, I saw my reflection. This is happening in the 80s. I didn't see many people that looked like me on TV doing positive things. And when I asked my mother, what is she doing? My mom said, she's doing science. And I said, well, that's what I'm going to do. And that just kind of sealed the deal. And as for Inventors, I feel fortunate because my path was really, has bits of light. And those bits of light were teachers. So it was Miss Donahue who in 5th grade. It was Miss Howard who was in my high school. It was, Clayton Bates, who was in graduate school. These are the people who kind of guided me, who were like beacons that I said, well, I just want to go in that direction. They served like my North Star. They couldn't solve all my problems. There was definitely a lot of hardships of being the first, the only, and different for many different reasons, but they could at least give me proof that it was possible. And that's the importance of having mentors, just to see your reflection. They won't make it easy for you, but they will tell you that you can do it.
So you say, use the word transformed in the title of the book, which is a very positive kind of spin. And then you do talk, as you did right now, about blue light and the implications of having your cell phone by your head all night. So what other things, somebody has actually just typed in a question here. Catherine Earle says, what's your most alarming insight into a particular technology we're using today?
Well, that's the final chapter of the Alchemy of Us, and that's computers. And that chapter is called Think. And I couldn't think of anything more human than our ability to think and to create, which is what that chapter is about. And I talk about how those things, to me, feel like they're under attack. By offsetting all of our information onto the web and using that as an external hard drive, when we create, we actually absorb the world, we let it simmer, and then we do something with it. But now we have a new relationship to information that we don't need to know. Oh, I'll just look that up later. Oh, I don't remember. And how do you create when you don't have the pieces to put things together in a new way? So I really feel that the way that our relationship with information is under attack. And I talk about that in the last chapter of The Alchemy of Us, how thinking is being modified by computers.
So this has often bothered me. I mean, you refer to this shallows as you talk about it, and I've often been concerned about this, that we've, instead of using these tools, we've somehow become enslaved by them. Nobody looks anything up in a book anymore. God forbid that they even have books in the house. And those critical and analytical skills that are so important when you're discovering and you're curious and you want to get to the answer, they're being lost. So we've become very adept at, Googling and doing all the various things multiply with our hands on the cell phone. But in terms of being able to actually think critically, and I don't just mean science, I think it's very important in science. It's probably more clear in science because, you have materials, method, conclusions. Whereas with the news, for example, today, we instant access to news, no time to actually let the problem sit and be analyzed long term. Everything is now. And that impatience with the, instant gratification, I don't know how you do away with that now, because we've created an animal that is like Pavlov's dog, I want it. Order food, look something up, GPS. So, not to mention language. Language is the Twitter is the next thing after the Telegraph, which
right. Well, I think books help. Books definitely help, and the reason why I wrote The Alchemy of Us, it's actually a stealth way to exercise that muscle for thinking about things critically. We have a lot of books that talk about technology, future technologies, AI, driverless cars, and we should be thinking critically about it. But we feel many people don't feel like they can because they're just so distant. They're so foreign. It requires a sophistication of knowledge that most people don't have. I don't know a lot about driverless cars, but I know to be critical of them. But I wrote the book because it's about old technologies, simple technologies that people will think are something they can understand. A telegraph is just dots and dashes. A light bulb is heating up a wire. And I'm showing how those technologies shaped us. So if we can look at the past and exercise that muscle for being critical, we're better prepared to look at technologies in the future. So I think books and analysis of old things, of looking at history, is very important to prepare us for the future. It seems odd, but history has so many lessons to prepare us for the future.
So in relation to that, should we have things like, I don't know that it could ever happen, health warnings that come when you buy your iPhone saying, this is, the blue light thing, if you do this more than 3 hours a day, it's going to damage your sleep patterns. And actually, would you mind talking about sleep and how even the light bulb has already affected that? I mean, the cell phone has definitely affected sleep patterns, but perhaps people don't know about how our sleep patterns are shaped by the light bulb.
I'll talk about how our sleep changed. But to answer your question about, there are smart technologies that are actually coming out on the market that can monitor, they call it your circadian light, and they will tell you, you need to get more blue light, or you need less blue light, or change the light. So those are actually coming on the market. And there are actually some light bulbs that are out there that will change their hue to be bluer and redder. So that's also on the market, or soon to be on the market. So people are aware of the limitations of artificial lights, and so they're starting to do some things about that. Now, going back to sleep, I actually talk about in The Alchemy of Us in the first chapter about how we used to sleep differently. Before the Industrial Revolution, we used to sleep in 2 segments, both 3.5 hours. So we turn in around 9 o'clock, sleep for about 3.5 hours, then wake up for about an hour and do things around the house, sew, read, and then go back to sleep for 3.5 hours. These segments were called first and second sleep. And everybody slept this way, all throughout the Western cultures. Now, what happened? How did sleep get changed? Well, 2 things, the light bulb and the clock. The clock was that we had to go to bed, we had to wake up at a certain time in order to go to the factory. So one of the segments got truncated. And the light bulb was we went to bed earlier because we wanted to do more in the evening. And so the second got truncated. And then eventually these 2 overlapped, they became consolidated, and it resembles the type of sleep that we have today. Now, researchers have done studies to see if this type of sleeping, this segmented sleep, is the natural way of sleeping. And they've done studies on people where they put them into dark rooms for 14 hours. They let them sleep off their sleep debt because they were completely exhausted. And guess what? They reverted back to this segmented sleep where they were sleeping for a couple of hours. They were in a drowsy state for about an hour or so, and then they went back to sleep. So there's a lot of thinking that this may be the normal form of sleeping. Also, when people talk about insomnia and a whole range of other sleep issues, some historians think that this may actually be an echo to segmented sleep. Many more studies need to be done. I talk about that in The Alchemy of Us, but sleep is one of the things that's been affected by our technologies. Mm-hmm.
Actually, it's quite interesting that the circumstances of this lockdown have changed people's sleep patterns dramatically. I've talked to a lot of people who are having trouble sleeping or else have this overwhelming desire to nap in the middle of the day.
Right.
And I don't think it's just boredom. I think it's some form of stress relief to check out. So maybe there's some good scientific data that's going to be revealed. Instead of getting a new mattress, maybe
I don't think you need, well, look, I don't want them suing me, but it just may be your approach to time. And if you have knowledge that there's this thing called segmented sleep, if you wake up in the middle of the night, don't turn on all the lights. You know, remember we just talked about that. We don't want the melatonin to rise. So stay in the dark if you can, or if you have a little red light, use that so that your body stays in nighttime mode, and then just ease back into sleep. Don't be anxious about waking up in the middle of the night. That's what I'm trying to get across.
Interesting. So some of the stories that you talk about in the book are fascinating. You know, I love the delivery of the woman delivering the time, but I thought that was really fascinating about a couple of things, like, for example, Frederick Douglass, who, you know, I thought of in terms of emancipation and his political life, but you say he was the most photographed man of his era. And was that because he was aware of his charismatic kind of, you know, presence, that he marketed that, or what was that about?
That's a very good question. I found out that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man in the world when I read some books. The name doesn't come to me immediately. It's definitely in the references for The Alchemy of Us. But he was using his likeness as a device to counter the stereotypes of what people thought of African Americans. There were a lot of caricatures of African Americans where they were Sambos or they looked like savages. And Frederick Douglass, if you've seen him, he just looks like royalty. He just has this regalness. And so he was trying to use his likeness. Any chance he got to go to a studio, wasn't that he was just a narcissist. He was trying to get his picture out there because these pictures were sold so that people could see another way of what an African American looks like. And what's funny is that every now and then, people will find a picture of Frederick Douglass. I was in Rochester, which is where he was from. And when I was in the library that day, someone said, "Hey, I have this old scrapbook and there's a picture of Frederick Douglass." It was authentic. He just took a lot of pictures of himself to make sure that people knew what our African American look like and how human they can look like as well.
He would have been a big hit on YouTube, I think. I think he would have known how to make maximum. Okay, to talk about language for a second. You said how our language has been affected by technology. So is not this yet another cause for concern that we're all tweeting? Some of us spell better than others, and no one mentioned there, but is this not just yet another way of us dumbing down? and losing our humanity, our ability to actually emote?
Right, right. Well, good question. Well, first off, there's many factors that have shaped American language. One of them is that America wanted to individuate itself from the UK, and one of the ways they did that was the way that they use language. So the US, we have a more informal style of speaking, very sparse, more melodious on the UK side of the pond. So that was like a deliberate cultural change. As for language shaping and shifting, linguists are actually not too afraid of that. They say that that's what happens because language is actually living. You know, if you look at old archaic words that we don't use anymore, well, what happened? Well, we don't, language shifts. We shed skin just like a snake. But what linguists are worried about is that because we've limited our communication to just really cool GIFs and text and emoticons, that we're really not picking up on the other ways that we communicate, which is to look at someone's eyes, to see if they are hesitant or if they're bored. We get visual cues. And as a result, if we don't exercise that muscle, we lose the ability to empathize. So that's the thing that is a little bit more scary than the shape of language. There are words that are going to change and grow, which is exciting. Language is a living thing. That's exciting. But the human skill of communicating in many other different ways, that's being lost. So that's the thing we should be concerned about.
Also, isn't there a tendency that we're getting, you mentioned finding all the answers on the phone, just look up the phone.
Right.
That we are so lazy with language now, we can get by on so few words. Instead of choosing the right word, which you need to do if you're, for example, poetry is a good analogy to me.
Mm-hmm.
Poetry is distilling a thought or a feeling into the fewest but most important words, which is a real discipline. But just saying, how old Cary Grant, famous telegraph message, I don't know if you ever know about that. He once received a telegram saying, how old Cary Grant, from a journalist, and he said, old Cary Grant, fine. I thought it was perfect. So but he was just dissing the lack of language and the
lack of language
nature of that question. So
I've talked to linguists about that too, and they say that they're able to see students code switch, meaning they can have their text speak, and then they can write, erudite papers for classes. I think the jury's still out as to how language will shape, but right now, linguists don't seem to be as concerned about that. They're more concerned about the empathy aspect of communication.
There's an app for that, by the way. Cheryl Turkle came and did a Cambridge Forum and said that when they discovered teenagers were starting to lose empathy, there was an app you could download for that.
Oh, great. That's good to know.
Yeah, good to know. Anyway, you raised some interesting points. You like this relationship between the arts and science, which I love too, this like tango that they do. And you were talking in your TED talk about how screenwriting and science discovery have parallels. Can you elaborate a bit more about that?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, probably more than a couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to work with the American Film Institute, and I was paired with a screenwriter. And we were tasked with writing a film which had accurate science in it. And as I was working with the screenwriter, I noticed that she had the same skills or the same things that I was interested in. She was a fanatic about details. She knew about iteration and rehearsal and the ability to trial and make errors. So I just saw these parallels. We often think of science having these skills, but it ends up the arts require them too. In order for things to be authentic, even if it is fiction, you must go through many cycles and test and probe to make sure that it comes off and it's accurate, or rather it's authentic to the feeling that you're trying to encapsulate. So I really thought that was important. And in my TED talk, I talk about how science and the arts actually need each other. The sciences, they both have these same set of skills, but also in thinking about the future, science thinks 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. But the arts can go way out to 30 years, show us what life looks like, and then inform science, hey, you need to be careful about this because in my thought experiment, I saw that this was a possible problem, and we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. And scientists don't want to work with artists because, you know, they want to be serious. But I think the better scientists know that this is how we make better products, and this is how we make a better world, by getting information from many different aspects. So that's what I talk about in The Alchemy of Us. And also the skills that I learned about screenwriting, I actually put into The Alchemy of Us. The things that I discuss when I'm talking about how technology has shaped us, I use stories. And I use the same kind of storytelling that screenwriters do, in terms of, so that you feel like, so you go on the journey with the people and say, oh yeah, that is not good. Or yeah, let's change that. And you feel you're driven along with the characters.
Well, you also mentioned about how, because artists imagine the future, they actually put us into these new scenarios which aren't yet, you know, realized. For example, you know, the cell phone. And I was aware of this watching, reviewing Blade Runner. I couldn't believe how much technology they had anticipated in that film. I mean, 30 years before it actually happened. So I don't know if they had a NASA expert giving them all this kind of tip-off information, because it really was pretty impressive that they had, you know, eye recognition and a GPS system. You know, this is years and years ago. So I think there's two reasons perhaps why it's important to have artists involved in the scientific process. One is looking at the human aspect, the humanity of whatever that invention is. So if you write a play, as we were talking earlier about plays that have come up and films in the last few years, like Hidden Figures, which revealed a whole cadre of women that we had never knew existed before.
Right.
And there they were, and we were, you know, completely captivated by the story. And then you have considering the implications. I think that's the important thing, of injecting humanity into a scientific situation where you have a moral dilemma. You know, the drone pilot, the woman operating the drone pilot, which was a play at the Central Theatre last year. And she realizes it's a child that she's going to put this bomb on, and she hesitates. And because she hesitates, she was fired. So her livelihood was dictated by her making a moral decision. And I think the morality of a lot of these things is terribly important. When we're looking at inventions, yes, we can do this, but should we do it?
Such a good question. It's such a good question. You know, as a person who was a scientist, you're so geeked out on the new phenomena that you've figured out. You're also distracted with raising funds and guiding graduate students that sometimes you forget to ask the question, is this a good idea? That's why we need the arts to say, you know what, this driverless car thing that you're working on sounds fantastic, but there's some ethical decisions that are being made in there, and you're not an ethicist. Is this a good idea? I think you should be talking to a philosopher or someone who can help you make better decisions. And what I'm talking about specifically is that when a driverless car is in a situation where there's an accident, a potential accident, it has to make a decision of who it's going to harm. And, you know, people who make code, they're great folks, but should they be making these decisions? No, I don't think so. I think they should be getting some information from the humanities. So we're totally on board. I think that the arts can illuminate this, because scientists may not be thinking that this is what they're doing. They're like, well, look, I just made this really cool technology. Isn't this great? Where they're not thinking that this technology is actually now going to be making decisions that impact human lives, and maybe not in the way that they would want to be affiliated with.
So you raise a lot of good points, particularly at this time, because the COVID crisis, everybody wants to do all things possible and go down all possible avenues. And then I've been reading some quite disturbing reports about the tracing aspect of using one's phone as a methodology, which of course they've been doing for a long time in China for tracking people. And yes, it might be helpful. It might be helpful in seeing who this person's been in contact with. It's not completely without error, that thinking, however. But do we want to surrender all our personal information, which can then be used for all sorts of other reasons?
That's right. That's right. It's always shown for one reason, but it's actually got many other reasons that are involved. And we have to be careful. So that's the reason why I wrote The Alchemy of Us, so that people would be more critical. I talk about privacy. Here we are listening to our music, and this is initially how they were tracking data when we were just listening to music, but now they know who you are, who you're with, and all you're doing is you're listening to music. You're focusing on the music part, but not knowing that your information is being sent to all these different places. So yeah, the intention, that one intention of tracking for mitigation of the disease is certainly sound and important. But the rest of it, the door that opens, we may not be happy with. And so that's why
we may not be able to close. I think that's also...
we won't be able to close it. No, not at all. Not at all. You won't be able to close it. And actually, I saw reports where they have actually tracked how many people are staying at home. 35% of Americans were staying at home, and it's slipped down to less. Well, how do they know that? They know because they've been tracking your cell phones. So, this is the cost of technology. We gain something, we give away something too. And what I'm saying is that we need to be aware of that so we can push back whenever possible.
So science can't be taken out of context. It's got to be hooked into all the other social and political and cultural implications.
Science is a cultural force. It's not neutral. It is an actor. It comes from humans, so it's going to have all the traits that humans have. All of our errors, all of our flaws, all of our shortcomings are in the technology and the system that it's made in, the political system, that also is in our technologies too. So we have to not think of it as neutral and it's all good. That's not true. We have to be critical of it. Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right about we need other people involved in the actual implications at the decision-making stage. If we're going to splice genes, well, what does that mean? What is the actual fallout of that? And I always remember when they were putting one of the shuttle missions up, they said, wow, we should have had a poet on the people that went to the moon, because we had all these very smart, spam in a can test pilots up there. Mm-hmm. But there was nobody to actually talk about and translate the experience into some sort of profound physical human experience in words. And the nearest, of course, they could do was they read from Genesis, because
right.
They were
perhaps in the future, but I think that's a good idea. We need to have all people so they can capture the experience, so we can all experience it in some way.
Okay, another question, two questions actually. The algorithm controlling social media create echo chambers and suppress original thought. What is the long-term effect of a constant deluge of selective information?
That's a good question. Well, I know that when people are trying to create change, they don't stay in echo chambers. They actually pay attention to people who they think are like the who are the antithesis of what they believe. So if we want a full picture of what's going on, sure, we can follow our social media, but we need to look at other newspapers or other sources of information to see what they are pulling out as important. And then we will have to fashion our own thought of what the world looks like. So yeah, we can't stay in that rabbit hole. We have to branch out and look and see how other people are thinking about events too.
Another question. Science explores what is possible, but not what is desirable or socially responsible. Should scientists be treated like the military and under control of civilians? That's a crazy question.
Well, you're trying to make me unpopular. I'm saying that scientists need to engage with the public, and the public should be more part of that dialogue. There's been this ivory tower for a long time, and well, it still exists in a lot of ways. It's starting to be broken down with better ways of communicating science. But the next thing, what we really need to have is a conversation. We need to have a conversation between the public and the scientists. The public will say, you know what, there's this disease that's not on your attention or not on your radar because it's not sexy, but it's impacting a huge population. Let's figure out how to mitigate this, how to fix this. See, we need to have those kinds of dialogues. So I agree. I don't think they should be under, I'm not a military person, but there should definitely be more of a conversation that's taking place between the sciences and the general public. I would agree with that.
Actually, the new series that PBS has been just started, I think it's a Ken Burns series on the gene. I don't know if you've seen it. It's incredible because it's the one series I've seen that actually considers the ramifications, moral ramifications of things.
That's great.
So it tracks when the genome project started, and oh, this is great. We can map all the human chromosomes. We can work out what diseases damage genes. But then when they found that they could insert genetic information, so they showed you the upside of that with something like sickle cell, which affects an entire population of people, and it's crippling, and it kills you. Against this other scientist, I think the Japanese or the Chinese, I can't remember, decided to go in vitro and give this child the vaccine that would mean it would never get HIV. In vitro, that gene.
Wow.
And there was outcry. This guy was presenting this at a meeting of scientists. And I think they had all signed, there was an international discussion and conference on this at the end of the Genome Project, where there was unanimous consent that gene splicing shouldn't be carried out for the sake of scientific curiosity. But again, this guy went ahead and did it. So I don't know, it's a real, I wonder if it's all too late to consider the ramifications of things, because business will hijack an idea and that's the end of your control over it. I mean, just think about splitting the atom, people working on that didn't know it was going to end up in Hiroshima.
Right.
And they couldn't say, oh, I want my idea back.
Right.
So it's a difficult thing. Intellectual property and moral responsibility are often collision course, the two of them.
Well, even though it's hard, that doesn't mean it shouldn't not be done. And there's always going to be some bad actors in scientists. Scientists are not scientists are people, and we've got some bad apples, a lot of bad apples. And so the younger folks, or the people who are aware of when bad apples are doing bad things, they should say something. And as for the atomic bomb, I mean, I've looked back and tried to figure out why people thought it was okay. They were told a certain story, they went with it, and they felt that that was their patriotic duty. Under duress, we make decisions that we may not be entirely proud of. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about the humanity at all steps of creating a technology. Even the simple cell phone, which I have over here, the materials that we choose, when a material scientist chooses a materials for technology, they usually choose the best performing material because, well, scientifically that makes sense. But some of these materials come from places where there's a lot of conflict. And what you're doing is you're setting up a kind of money flow to places where, well, you probably don't want there to be a flow of money. The thing that you should do is use materials that maybe are not ideal, but they have a better footprint or there's less conflict. That's not sexy to a scientist, but that's what we should be doing. So that's going to change the way that scientists do business. Okay, maybe not this material because bad things are happening there, but maybe this material. It's not ideal, but at least people aren't getting hurt. So that's part of the dialogue that I mean in terms of being engaged with history and how society is operating, that science shouldn't be separate from it, but it should be also in it as well.
You talk about some interesting things, which is a microcosm of a larger issue in the book, which is often that people that get all the credit aren't necessarily deserving of it. And then certain people did all the work, Rosalind Franklin and DNA come to mind, and don't even get a footnote in history. So did you go to extra lengths to try and dig up some people that had been passed over?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the points of the Alchemy of Us was to show little known figures or little known inventors who made significant impact to society. So in the chapter 5 of the Alchemy of Us, I talk about the light bulb. And if you're on this side of the pond, you think about Edison. Well, I read a lot of books about Edison, a lot of biographies, and I would see in the footnote, Edison went to Connecticut to visit this man named William Wallace. Well, who's this guy? Ends up I live in Connecticut, so I could actually find out who he was. He actually created an early form of light. Edison actually came to Connecticut to visit him, was inspired to to embark on electric lights because of that visit. And as he left William Wallace's house, he said, "Oh, I see the way that you're making lights." Wallace had made an arc light, which was far too bright. And Edison said, "I think you're going in the wrong direction. I'm going to beat you." And then he goes back to Menlo Park and he creates the electric light that we know. Well, Wallace was overshadowed by Edison, but he deserves to have some credit because, well, he was a catalyst for all this. So there are many of these types of stories, people who made inventions that are part of our everyday lives that don't even have Wikipedia pages at the time of writing this book, who should definitely be highlighted, and they get their moment in the Alchemy of Us. Mm-hmm.
So speaking of that, you've talked about a certain number of women scientists in the book, and also, you allude to, Black heroes too, and heroines. Can you speak to that about why, well, we all know that history's, written by the victors,
right.
How we change that revision of things. Were there women scientists around? It came out during the DNA inquiry that was on television recently, when this Black scientist was asked about why Rosalind Franklin hadn't published the picture of the double helix. She said, well, she was too scared to, because she had to be 1,000,000% certain that she had her story right before she did anything risky like publish. So she was held to much higher standards to be included in the club. And I just wanted to know if you thought that was still, the way.
Very much active. It's a system. It's a system to oppress people. When I was coming through the process of starting off as a little girl in New Jersey who wanted to be a scientist and to graduating with my PhD, there were so many places where people were just filtered and removed from the process. Let's say that the pipe, there was this many people. By the end of it, there's just a handful of people, just eliminated for reasons that other people may get the benefit of the doubt. So I can understand that when Rosalind Franklin was in her position, there were very few women who were at her level. And so she had to operate, because she was representing half of the population, that she had to be more than excellent, so that when it was critiqued, they would say, okay, that's okay, even though her work was excellent. So I totally understand that. And when people say, oh, there weren't any women, it's because they're not paying attention. They're not paying attention that there's this entire system that's eliminating people from the very beginning to partake in science. I remember when I was in grammar school, people wanted to do science. It wasn't cool. They got eliminated. In high school, there were other people, they got eliminated. In college, they got eliminated, until you have a very few number of people. And when you have a few, when I graduated and got my PhD in material science, there were 9 African-American students who got a PhD that year. Not at Stanford, in the country. There are far more people who wanted to get PhDs. The system eliminates a lot of people. So it's naive to say that there weren't any. They're just not, their blinders are on, and they're not seeing the whole holistic view of what's going on in terms of how people are progressing through the STEM pipeline.
Also, you talk about the fact that who is doing the research and who is setting the agenda is also dictated by predominantly white men. For example, I mean, you can give us 2 instances. One is the design of the airbag, and the Polaroid pictures, how they came about. Perhaps you could just mention both of those in terms of how technology is dictated by the market, but the market's
That's right. Well, I mean, there's been studies that have shown that airbags, when they deploy, they actually kill some populations, and definitely babies, because they were designed for tall men, maybe 5'10", 240-pound male. Well, when these airbags were deployed in Japan, there were women who were killed because they were far smaller than that spec. But there's this assumption that, okay, I'm designing this airbag, it works for me, so I'm going to put this on the market. I'm the average, and everyone should follow suit to this design. And so it doesn't work for everyone. And the same assumption it happens when I talk about in Polaroid, when I talk about photographic film. Early photography didn't pick up the likeness of African Americans because the film had been formulated so that it was specialized to pick up well white skin. And this was found in the 1950s when African American mothers were getting pictures for the classroom picture back. And this is after the desegregation of schools. They would see that their children were very, very dark and in the shadow, but the white students were perfect in the picture. And why is it? Because the formulation couldn't handle that range. And so eventually the formulation was changed. But it's, again, the assumption was that this is the ideal customer for this film, and so we're going to idealize it so that it works for this population. And then when this goes on to the market, it works for that one population and it doesn't work for a wide swath of people.
So I think things like going to plays that have dealt with science issues and social issues, as you say, cultural issues of the time, and movies now, increasingly movies such as Hidden Figures, give us a truer and fuller picture of the past. So I think it's very important, as you say, for everybody to be involved in the discussion. So
absolutely,
more, scientists of color or minorities or women need to be writing the story.
I agree. And I say this also because when I was writing The Alchemy of Us, I would go back to the archives. I would read a ton of books on a topic, Edison or the development of Pyrex. Every book there was, I read it. And it's interesting what authors choose to focus on, because I would go back to the raw original material and I'd say, well, why did you focus on that? Or why did you overlook that? That's kind of continuing on with this story about the great genius or what have you. So it's very important to have, of course, diversity in the sciences, but also diversity in those who are writing about the sciences, so that they can go back and tell new stories. Because if we're telling the same old stories, we're doing a disservice. If we're lofting genius, that doesn't help people. What we need to do is make innovation and invention seem down to earth. Also, we need to make sure that people feel that they too can innovate. So we show stories of people who had no business inventing because maybe they didn't have a PhD, but they just had a problem that they wanted to solve. And that was motivation enough for them to create something. Everyone is in that kind of situation. And if they see someone else can do that, then they'll feel that they can do that. And if they can see the reflection, maybe that person is of color or a woman or disabled, or we just need a wide swath of different stories so that people can see their reflection and feel that whatever that character is doing, that they can do too.
Someone's written here, you speak of the need for scientists to be involved in the arts. What are you doing in the arts?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I've been a science consultant for a couple of films from the American Film Institute. When they write their films, they want to say something and it could be science fiction. And I would say, well, you know what? You don't actually need to do science fiction. You can actually use science fact to kind of solve that problem. So I've worked with those kinds of artists, and I still do a little bit of that today. But mostly what I'm doing is in the arts, which is I write books and I write stories, and I hope that it compels people to want to make plays or do movies, because I've done the work of defining or translating the science, putting it in a context, putting it in a story, and making it easier for other people to display the story through other platforms. So for the last couple of years, it was mostly my work in writing the book, but before then, it was doing some consulting for folks in the movie business.
Also, you mentioned quite fun things, which is, don't be afraid to fail. First of all, the innovation is universal, which I think is
right.
A good point, but also that the original prototypes of things are often terrible. Like you were talking about the computer disk.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty good story.
Well, the computer disk, first of all, IBM wanted to make a new way to store information because the punch card was just becoming too onerous. 16 billion cards were being made a year. And this is before words like sustainability and green were actually in people's language. It was just that it was too much. So they needed another way to store information. So a few engineers went over to California because that was the holy grail for creativity. And they're like, come up with another way to make something. Oh, and they didn't give them a laboratory or a machine shop. They're like, look, just come up with an idea. Well, they decided to use magnetic materials. And since they didn't have a shop, they went to the junkyard and they picked up pieces from the junkyard. One person found an old refrigerator, so they cut a circle and made a round disc. Another person found a motor, and then they decided that they were going to use magnetic materials. And so one gentleman went to a paint company that made orange paint, and so it had iron oxide in it. They used that. They used all different types of materials. And then they had to spread this paint onto the surface of that disc. So they got a drill press and poured the paint, and it spun out like spin art. That was the first hard disk. Now we take hard disks for granted because we have so much memory, but it started off as piles of junk from a junkyard. And I tell that story so that people will feel like, well, wow, innovation isn't even cute. I can do that. I got junk. So go make something. That's what I wanted to impel people to do.
Yeah, I think if you look back through history and invention, not only do people sometimes have unforeseen outcomes to things, penicillin being one, if you're just observant enough to watch something's going on, but often it's fixing a problem and improvising to try and fix a problem that brings about the lateral thinking. How can we do this? And what do I have that I'm working with here that might be able to do it? Trial and error, really.
It's trial and error is just a fancy way to say fail a lot. And I always tell people, I'm like, scientists are very good at marketing things. Oh, it's trial and error. It's like, yeah, you failed a whole lot. And I also think that when we're innovating, that's very important for people to be exposed to different things, because all those different things inform your creation. Taking music lessons, learning to build something, going fishing, those things will all kind of sit in the back of your mind. And later on, when you have to solve a problem, you're like, oh yeah, this reminds me of this experience that I had some time ago. Maybe I can solve it this way. There's so many stories in science about how one person loved one thing and how it informed another thing. And I think that's one of the elements of creativity that we can work hard to nurture so that people feel that they too can be scientists or innovators.
So I've got another question from somebody else. You mentioned that Hemingway was a beneficiary of the telegraph. Who was the beneficiary of the current computer language?
Good question. As I said, I think that linguists think that language is evolving. So I don't know who would be the computer. Maybe it's the new millennial writer, last name is Rooney, Normal People, the author of Normal People. They say that her writing is very much resembles those who are using computers and text messages. I read a couple of pages. I didn't get to deep dive into it. But maybe in a couple of years, we'll be able to identify who is the writer who represents the times. I think it may be still a little too early.
Interesting. Some of the rapping poets probably would be, brief.
Yeah, the staccato style.
Yeah,
yeah, definitely.
So thank everybody that zoomed in. Very good of you. I hope you got a lot of questions answered, or at least we piqued your interest for further investigation. Thanks for your support and see you soon. So goodbye.
Thank you.